So we're going to be talking now about a vision for the future in lots of different ways, including technology, but much more broadly about the vision for the future as well. So I've got 4 fantastic guests as well. I'm going to introduce them as we go. So Lucia is a final year education student and student ambassador at the University of Cambridge and part of our Edge Youth Network. And Lucia's going to set a bit of a challenge for the start of the session. Over to you.
Yeah. I'm reading off my phone, which I think is kind of symptomatic of me being that young generation. And the fact that I really can't remember the last time I used pen and paper for my degree. Because everything is online and all of those kind of digital schools, yet at the same time it's kind of, I'm a social sciences student kind of, but then I apply for internships and they're like, well, can you code? And I'm like, well, no, I can't code because I'm writing essays. And so as someone who's a student still, there's still so much confusion about education and about what's needed and skills and how to prepare for the job market that actually no one seems to be quite in agreement with. And can I also just ask, are there any other students in the room? 1! Yay! Why is that? Why is that we're sat here and we're all saying really interesting things about education and about assessment, yet how often do students actually get to voice that? And maybe you voice it to a teacher, but does it get to, you might say, miss, this exam, this was really hard, I really struggled. But does that make it to the head of department? Does that make it to the head of education on a policy level? And why isn't that happening? For a conference like this, okay, well, it's kind of not really aimed at students, but why not? Why can't we invite students into spaces? Because students have things to say. We're here when invited. But we don't have conferences for students like that. In a way which maybe we should. I interned at Cambridge Press and Assessment briefly, and one of my jobs was sorting through a survey with 90,000 responses from people who'd done English language assessment tests. Imagine if we had that for GCSEs, what type of responses you'd get from students. 90,000 students saying how they felt. And by and large, there were many negative things to say. And that was really interesting, straight from the horse's mouth. What are they saying? How are they feeling? No guessing how students feel, just actually knowing. And if we had that data, I think it would be really hard hitting, and I think that would really impact how we approach the future of education. So yeah, I'm a student. I'm still in the education system. Which is quite depressing to still be in the education system because there's a lot of things wrong with it. And I'm having to, as a student of education, it's kind of a bit meta, I'm always having to learn about this kind of endless list of problems, and I could list some, but it would probably all just get too depressing. But we come to conferences like this, and it's really important to say, okay, we need to fix this. We need to fix these problems. But at what point are we able to move beyond that? Because when I think about the future of the education, I don't just want to think about patching up holes. I'm at the precipice of, maybe at the start of my career, exciting, but it doesn't always feel very exciting because it feels like there's a lot of things that are really messed up. And I want education, the future of education, to be able to, innovate and excite and improve for kind of the sake of that. And for the sake of being exciting and improving, rather than because, the ship is flooding and we need to smack a Band-Aid on it. So yeah, I want rich potential and I want fresh possibilities in the future of education. And the way I see that being tackled, I see 2 kind of main approaches to solutions. I see evolution, or I see revolution. So kind of evolution, kind of thinking about prefigurative changes, what can be done on a teacher by teacher, school by school, MAT by MAT basis. And those small changes then hopefully gradually growing into something bigger and being able to make a more powerful, positive impact. Or we have the idea of revolution and that kind of big organizational policy level shift in education, like a really top-down approach, targeting the roots. And whichever approach you're more instinctively drawn towards, that change has to happen somehow, and it is really worth thinking about, well, what direction do we want to go in, or what combination? Especially because change in education, sometimes I think about it and I think it feels stagnating, and that was that I'm scared of big scary change. Like this phrase revolution, it's like, oh my God, that's revolutionary, that's scary. But actually, our massified education system in the UK, as we know it, is only about 100 years old. You know, GCSE, SATs and Ofsted are all only 30 to 40 years old, and free schools, the new national curriculum and phonics screening tests are all younger than me. So the status quo is not inevitable whatsoever. And as someone who hasn't been sitting and ruminating on that status quo for maybe, you know, as long as some people who are much more experienced in education than me, it's something that I'm really always thinking about, how can we push that? So yeah, when I think about the future of education and what I want for that, I think about attending conferences where we're improving and thinking about what to do new in assessment, just for genuinely to brighten the experience of students and to make sure that students get the most out of it, rather than because we're needing to patch it up, or, you know, perhaps maybe cynically because we want a school or a company to have their kind of unique selling point within the, you know, increasingly kind of competitive neoliberalized framework of education. And also for all the amazing initiatives and practices that are already going on, for those to be really, really equitably accessible for everyone. You know, I was a student who had COVID hit during my A-levels, and it was really jarring to see the disparity between me and my peers. Friends at other schools who had, you know, constant full school days of lessons. My school had no online lessons. And myself and many other students I knew did not have stable access to the internet, and that was a really challenging time. And so, you know, stuff like EdTech, I think, but all sorts of schemes happening on, you know, sometimes it feels like a postcode lottery, you know, that's a real talking point in education. But when we're thinking about innovation in particular, thinking how can we make that accessible for everyone, regardless of student background, you know, ability or disability, the type of school you attend. So yeah, change needs to happen, but we mustn't ever lose sight of who is actually going to have access to that change, regardless of whether it comes through revolution or evolution. Yeah.
Thank you. A great challenge to start us off with, and I'm giving the other panelists fair warning that at the end I'm going to ask you whether you want evolution or revolution, so get thinking about that while you're talking. In the meantime, Timo, I'd love to bring you next. Timo is the founder of SchoolDash, which does some amazing work on school data, but I know you've also got a really strong interest in AI, which has come up a lot already. Timo.
Has indeed, thank you. Thanks so much. So definitely not a student, not even an educator, so I sort of feel like I'm the one learning here today. I'm really a technologist by sort of inclination and vocation, a neuroscientist by training originally, and so I do have this sort of endless fascination, obsession perhaps, with human minds and sort of silicon brains, if you like, and how the latter can support the flourishing of the former. And as Olly said, that manifests itself at the moment in my running SchoolDash, which is an education data analytics firm, but I also get involved in lots of other technology related issues around education and research and academia. And one of the things I was involved in recently was an AI in Education Summit that we ran in London in November as a fringe event for the Bletchley Park Summit, and some of the people here were present at that meeting as well. And I wanted to just offer some thoughts, partly that sort of came from or came out of that event, and also many subsequent discussions I've been having since then, because as has already become apparent today, I think there are lots of aspects where technology bears on the question of reform in education and assessment. So one thing that I wanted to say, and this was important for our framing of the discussion in November, was that I think it's really important to have a kind of a very broad definition of AI. And I think that is coming over today, but I just really want to emphasize it. Lots of people are talking about ChatGPT or chatbots or large language models very specifically. They're amazing, they're brilliant, I use them, it's exciting. There's all sorts of problems with them as well, of course, but it is an exciting development. But you know, chatbots have been around since the 1960s. They have got a lot better, and they've got surprisingly better quickly recently, but they have been around for a long time. But more to the point, large language models aren't the only type of generative AI. You know, generative AI is not the only use of deep learning. Deep learning isn't the only type of machine learning, and machine learning is not the only type of AI, right? So there's a whole world out there of different technologies. And in fact, most of the systems that we're going to end up using, that are going to end up being useful, are going to be some sort of hybrids of those things. So I think it's really important just to bear that in mind. We're not just talking about ChatGPT and its kin. Incidentally, I also think it's super important to have a very broad definition of education, because I think one of the consequences of technology and ongoing education reform is going to be the blurring of boundaries between things like, formal education and lifelong learning, and vocational education versus academic education and so forth. One other thing I just wanted to say briefly was, I think it's really important, and again, I think this has been reflected in the discussion, but I think a lot of discussions around technology in education focus on how we learn, right? So chatbot tutors, things like Khanmigo, those kinds of things, which are, again, exciting and important, but we also need to be thinking about what we learn, and this has really come over today. There was a lot of that in the panel, particularly in the first panel, but also some of it in the second panel as well. I love the Picasso quote. He said, "Computers are useless; they only give you answers." Right? We need to learn how to ask good questions of the technology as well, right, and how to use it. And all the stuff we've been hearing about critical thinking. Fabrizio talked about that all-important AI, academic integrity, those kinds of skills, metacognitive skills, learning how to learn and so forth, they're super important. I think the other aspect, not just how we learn and what we learn, but also how we work is super important. And this is not just about the broader world of work, it's also about how we work as a sector, right? How we employ this kind of technology behind the scenes, under the hood, right? Things like predictive analytics in order to anticipate and mitigate potential problems rather than have to deal with them post hoc. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another thing that I think is really important is, and again this has come up a bit today, the tail, the sort of the risk of the tail wagging the dog. So we heard a version of that earlier on. Jeffrey raised the issue that was repeated again in the last panel around, do we measure the things we value or merely value the things we measure? I live this through my work with SchoolDash. I have a database with 1 billion data points in it about every school in the country. I can't tell you anything about how happy kids are at school, right? Which I just think is completely shocking. But there's a version of it with technology, and particularly with the hype around AI, that we ask ourselves, how can we use this technology rather than what do we want education to be, right? So it gives us all sorts of exciting affordances, but the question is not how can we deploy a chatbot. The question is, right, what do we want 21st education to be, and therefore how can some of these innovations help us to do that? And that was a big reason why we held that summit, in order for the sector itself to take the initiative, not to cede it automatically to technology companies. I love technology companies, Maria, wherever you are. Many of my best friends work in technology companies, but they shouldn't be in the driving seat when it comes to the future of education, nor frankly should government, right? I think the education sector itself should be facilitated by those groups and others. Finally, I just wanted to say, just in terms of outcomes, and this speaks a little bit to Lucia's point actually, is how we get there, right? Because I think one of the problems, so one of the profound challenges, but also the most exciting things, is none of us know what the answers look like, right? None of us know what the ultimate outcome will be, because this landscape is shifting and it's a very complicated, interdependent question. So what we need to do is we need to create a much more adaptable system, right? We have a system that teaches, but not a system that can learn itself, right? It's very, very ossified, it's very inflexible. I talk a lot with people in government and within education about this. I think there are ways of doing it. Happy to talk to that more during this session or beyond. But we need to be, in particular, supporting and highlighting grassroots innovation, supporting and connecting people who are doing amazing work already at the coalface of education, in order to create a system, and I'm giving away my answer to Lucia's question actually, that can evolve over time, because none of us have the answers, and those answers are not going to come top down from government or from me or from anyone else, right? We need to create a system, as I say, that can not only teach but can learn. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Timo. Wonderful. I want to bring Tom in next. Tom is Curriculum Assessment and Inspection Specialist at ASCL. Tom.
Thank you, Ollie. Really lovely to be here. ASCL represents 25,000 head teachers, CEOs, principals and other senior leaders across the UK. I myself am a former senior leader of an academy in Essex. In my 5 minutes, I want to make 3 quick, brief points. The first is about what change could look like and should look like, and what the starting point that should be. The second is then what the considerations are around that. And then thirdly is what's already been promised to us by different political parties and what that might mean. So starting with where we should start this conversation, I come completely back to Chris's point in his question in the first panel, which is around what we call at ASCL the forgotten third. That third of young people who every year do not achieve a grade 4 in English and maths at GCSE, those key passport qualifications that allow them to become social workers and teachers and doctors and nurses and so on. I slightly disagree with Jeffrey about the way that grading works. We don't have norm referencing grading in this country, we never have, but the fact is we have this stubborn statistic of a third of young people who don't achieve every year. And what do we get them to do? We just get them to resit it and resit it and resit it. And only a third of that third go on and achieve a better grade than they did in year 11. So I think if we start by thinking about assessment reform from the point of that third of young people and what will work for them, then it will be better for everyone else. So rarely start from that point. So my first point is we need to think about that forgotten third and have that as the basis for any reform. My second point then is what this could look like, and this comes to the question that a colleague over here raised around the accountability system. Whatever you think about Michael Gove's reforms, which are now a decade old, scarily, what he got right about them is he saw that you had to reform curriculum, assessment, qualification and accountability all at the same time, because those things are so interlinked. So if we're thinking about this question of the next generation of assessment, we have to think about what that's where we start with the curriculum, what do we actually want young people to learn, then we have to think about what it means to actually how we assess, and then how we certificate that through qualifications, and then how we hold schools and colleges to account. So I think with any of these discussions, we have to think about all those four things in tandem. I would suggest, and again I'm sort of answering Lucia's question a little bit here, at ASCL we think that that should be an incremental change though, because, and we also, we have to be very certain that any changes that we suggest as a sector is going to have the payoff that we want it to. It will increase workload. Any reform will increase workload. So we have to be absolutely sure that those changes that we're asking for in this forum and others are going to have a big enough effect, particularly on that forgotten third, particularly on disadvantaged learners, particularly on SEND learners, with the workload that will inevitably bring. We need to think about the mechanism for how we do that curriculum and assessment change. And again, Timo sort of talked about this, and I'm going to sort of misquote Laura McInerney, the journalist there. He says education is too important for politicians to be involved in, but too important for politicians not to be involved in. So we need to find a mechanism, a way, where we can have a proper curriculum review that is apoliticised, but is still accountable to government. Because essentially that's where it's being funded from. So finally, what has been promised? Well, I can't believe we've got to this point in the conference on a conversation about the future assessment without talking about the elephant in the room, the advanced British standard, or what we call at ASCL advanced BS. The consultation closes in a few weeks' time. Who knows what will happen with it? The point is that any incoming government, any colour, will have a huge range of information, a huge bank of resources to draw on when looking at assessment reform. So I would encourage people to engage with that consultation. And of course, Labour have promised a curriculum and assessment review within their first 100 days if they are elected later this year. So I think change is inevitable and there is a real appetite for it. I also think it's inevitable that digital assessment, as we've talked a lot about this morning, will be the future. But I think we have to be very, very careful about that. And I think the starting principles for that should be around what is the best way to assess a particular item. If it is on screen, let's do it on screen. If it's pen and paper, let's do it on paper. So I think we need to start with that fundamental principle. What is the best way to assess that particular assessment item? We need to be very, very mindful of that disadvantage gap and not increasing that where people don't have access to hardware and to software. But I think it is inevitable and it's coming. That's it from me. Thanks, Olly.
Thank you so much, Tom. And to complete the panel, lovely to welcome you, Professor Gabrielle Finn, who is Vice Dean right here in Manchester. Over to you.
Thank you. So I thought I'd take a slightly different tack and talk a little bit about some of the projects we're doing at Manchester to future-proof assessment. I've recently changed jobs to be Associate Vice President for Teaching, and with that I inherited the most poisoned chalice of all, future-proofing all assessment in an institution with 45,000 students. So I have to try and get through what's called our assessment framework through Senate. So that is every policy, procedure and guidance document pertaining to assessment at this institution. It needs to work for the School of Health Sciences, who have 17 different regulators. It needs to work for music, for maths, for the engineers. Everybody thinks their programme is the best. It's the most special. It's the most different. So in looking at that, there's a few fundamental tensions that I've identified in thinking about how we improve the assessment for students. The first is that we've got this one-size-fits-all approach to assessment across the university, not acknowledging learner differences, and we're doing some research that I'll speak about in a minute about that. But then there are a few other inherent tensions. The first is that we have a mistrust of students. AI doesn't help. And a fear of both technology and cheating that's driving all of our assessment decisions. And when I say our, I do speak about Manchester, but I speak about the sector as a whole. There's a real challenge there in trying to get good practice and deliberately not saying best practice, because best practice it strips away all the context that we're thinking about, of what works for who, where, when, how. But in terms of those tensions, we're really trying to grapple now with how do we do all of this? How do we support individual learners? How do we support inclusive assessment, but not let that fear of technology, of students and of cheating take over? We're trying to find a balance here in terms of our measuring competence and long-term performance, because competency-based assessment for programs like medicine is so important. Engineers, they need to get the maths right or the bridge is going to fall down. Pharmacists need to get the drug dose right or they will kill someone. And I'm not saying this flippantly, this is what we're dealing with in a higher education institution. So we want the competence, but we want to engage the learners and then look at that long-term performance, whilst trying to maintain credibility in what can often be seen by students as quite subjective judgments. So we've rewritten the assessment framework. We're in the middle of a perpetual cycle of consultation. It will kill me, but we'll get there. And we've got some new principles that all of our assessments at this institution will be inclusive. And that's inclusive by design. They will be trustworthy and they will be relevant. Now, when we've been consulting, many of our colleagues have many hills on which they will die. And one of them seems to be around authentic assessment and the need for it to be real world. And this is where I've found another tension, and that's with our student voice. So the Students' Union wanted to write a new strategy for assessment. We've kind of talked them back a little bit, because what we don't want is a Students' Union strategy for assessment that's completely juxtaposed to what we're trying to do as an institution. We want to work together to produce something, that vision for the future. But interestingly, while the students want us to help them develop, to participate in assessments that will help their employability, help them develop towards graduate outcomes, they want us to outlaw, and this is their word, not mine, outlaw group work. So we're trying to help the students to see the value in the assessment and the curriculum, but we're not allowed to do it through group work. And this is a challenge, I'm sure you can all imagine. We need to look at how can we help students to think about the professionalisation of assessment. How can we show them where it will enhance their employability and the employability outcomes? They have a real fear of peer assessment. But I think one of the biggest issues is that we don't acknowledge culture in assessment enough, and that's what we need to do towards the future. Advanced HE have a really nice page on their website where they talk about assessment being neither value neutral or culture free. And we're looking at that specifically at Manchester, and I think that comes into partly the group work because students are struggling with being thrown into a melting pot of all sorts of different cultures. That we're talking about cultures who are naturally more outspoken, people who come from a background where they may be quite misogynistic, or just the barriers, you know. Often assessments are written by the people who passed them, not people who failed and struggled to get on in higher education. So there's a few issues that we need to start to unpack there. But speaking of the culture, that's probably one of the biggest areas I do think that has been ignored within HE, and when we talk about inclusive assessment. Now that used to be talked, when it was first coined, that was all about disability. But now it's become a real catch-all term, and I don't think it's particularly helpful. As we move to the future, I'd like to see that one binned and maybe changed to, I don't know, I haven't quite worked that out yet actually. Enhanced assessment, there's all sorts of different things, but it's become a catch-all for socially just assessment, for talking about inclusivity across all different protected characteristics, and in that the learners are getting lost because we're pigeonholing them and we're not talking about their intersecting identities. Recently, we've been looking at our awarding gaps, which are significant across the sector, but at Manchester we have an 18% awarding gap in the faculty that I just left between black and white students. 18%. We're asked to reduce these awarding gaps, but then we're not looking at what's actually caused them. So we've done, I think when I was here last year, we just started in this project. We've since done 168 interviews with students, trying to explore why aren't they attaining? 5%, this is not a statistical study, but 5% I would say is assessment and curricula. The other 95% that means students aren't able to perform on assessments is the everything else. It's the microaggressions, it's the culture, it's the misogyny, it's the racism, it's the institutional bias that happens every day, day in, day out, before they even come onto campus. So for example, for some of our black students, they were telling me they came to campus first thing on a morning, they were racially abused on the metro on the way in. We then offered them free haircuts on campus, but nobody could cut afro hair. If this has all happened to you before 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we expect students to perform when they come in, you can see how we're ending up perpetuating all of these different huge awarding gaps. So I think for me, moving forward, the future has to be looking more at the individual learners and where culture presents in our assessment.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Okay, so I'm going to come back down the panel in just a moment and ask you, A, whether you're going to be a revolutionary or an evolutionist, but also before we go to lunch, I want to end on a positive note. So I want you to tell me something that's really inspired you recently or even today about kind of the future of assessment, just so we can send people off with some positive things, giving you that fair warning. One of the things that I really picked up from that I just wanted to kind of share was it really feels like we're starting to get things in the right order in this conference. As we go on talking about it, there's this point about the vision of education coming first, what we want to get to, then the vision of the curriculum, then the vision of assessment, and then how can technology help us. And I think often in these debates we let various tails wag various dogs, but I think it's really helping me to start thinking about things in that kind of order. And just your point about how many students have we got in the room, I should have put my hand up because I'm learning Dutch on Duolingo, so I'm kind of a student. But the reason I mention that is it's so refreshing to do that compared to trying to learn French as a GCSE when I was a kid. It was really boring. I can barely speak French in a functional way, and yet there I am plugging away like before work, doing my exercises, and the assessment's built in and it's testing me, but I can see why I'm being assessed because it's showing the bits that I'm weaker at and then I'm doing more on it. And it feels like it's just a really nice, positive use of the technology that's evolving to really make that language learning a much more pleasant experience. So that's my positive. Lucia, can I come to you for evolution or revolution and something positive to share with you?
Probably a bit of both.
Okay.
It feels like a slight cop-out, but I'll explain why, because I think evolution is great. I think clearly there are so many people with so many different ideas, so many startups, so many amazing teachers, like everyone really working to do things, but as a lot of people have pointed out, there's still the limitations of policy. You know, there's still the limitations of having to teach to the exam or having to teach to the national curriculum, and wanting to push things further, but having, you know, being limited by like accountancy regulations, all of this. So evolution is really great, but there also still needs to be that kind of like policy, there still needs to be some amount of policy level allowing that evolution to take place, which then to me does seem to fit more in the revolution side of things. And I think my positive takeaway is, again, sort of in the same vein, I kind of said it's depressing to be an education student sometimes because it's just me writing essays about, like, here's another problem in education. But it's really refreshing to come here and see people being hopeful and coming here with exciting ideas, and also maybe as a more specific thing, the kind of consultation with the student union. You know, that was kind of my opening point about why aren't we inviting students to share their ideas, and so it's always really great to hear about when there is that dialogue happening, because I think, you know, we can talk about Socratic education sometimes, but we don't actually have that Socratic dialogue between the students and the educators and the policymakers. So yeah.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, evolution and revolution, I like that description. Tom?
I think for the reason I said in terms of those 4 areas having to work together, I'm going to say revolution, which I didn't think I would say at the start. But I think because you have to do all of those together, I'm going to say revolution, but with the caveat that we have to be so mindful that it is going to be in the interest of students. Why I'm happy at the moment, I think there is a genuine clamour for change in this space. Across the sector, across the awarding organisations, from Ofqual, the regulator, and even from the current government and the shadow government. So I think there's genuinely room for optimism there.
Thank you, Tom. And development within the space of a 40-minute panel. I can't ask for any more than that. It's like, this is live stuff. Timo?
I'm going to hedge my bets a little bit as well. So I'm going to say evolution for the reasons I explained before. I don't think we know the answers yet, and therefore we need to be adaptable in light of experience and the evolving landscape. So I think it needs to be evolution. On the other hand, in order to achieve that evolution, I think there needs to be a revolution in the way we think about the education system and its attitude to adaptability and risk. So if you talk about risk, if you use the word risk to anyone at the Department for Education, they think about catastrophic risk, right? Education failure, financial failure, safeguarding risk. We need to embrace the idea of sort of what I would term entrepreneurial risk, right? Taking, you know, well-considered risks, or, you know, leaping into the unknown a little bit in order to gain some upside, right? Even if you don't know what the outcomes are, we have to be willing to we'd be willing to do that and indeed enable and encourage it. You also want some cause for optimism, was the other thing, wasn't it? So let me say, I don't know, this might be a bit of an odd one, I don't know, but so I'm a classic STEM bigot, right? I'm a complete computer geek, neuroscientist, all of that stuff, but I passionately believe that, you know, knowledge isn't siloed like that, right? And I think we need to get beyond that, and I think that will become more and more pressing. And I had a really great conversation. So I'm involved in bringing in a meeting that we hold in California, where we bring social scientists and humanities people together with technologists over a weekend at the Meta campus of all places. And I had a great conversation with a guy called Sam Weinberg and his colleague Joel Breakstone from Stanford University. So Sam is a professor of history at Stanford University, and I had one of the most interesting conversations that I've ever had around technology and its meaning for humans and for society. He has something, or they have something called the Digital Inquiry Group, which is all about bringing critical thinking skills from history and the humanities into the digital realm. And it's sort of going back to some of the things we were talking about earlier around those human skills, those meta skills, right, that become not less important but more important. And I think all of this talk about STEM skills, great, I'm all for STEM skills, don't get me wrong, but I think those other skills are going to become more important, not less important. And that discussion I had with a history professor in Stanford, I think really brought that home to me.
Thank you, Timo, that's great. Gabrielle?
I think evolution, because revolution would infer that everything we've done in the past is wrong. And I think what we need to do is use the evidence base and build on it and keep progressing. And in terms of that optimism, the fact that the Students' Union care enough about assessment to want to write a strategy document, something I try and avoid doing at all costs, I think that's really inspiring. We might not 100% agree on the content, but they care enough to want to make an improvement for all of their peers and future cohorts. I think is pretty inspirational.
I love that. It's a great place to end. Can I have another round of applause for our excellent panel?